The Forbidden Love, Family Curse, and Dark Legacy Reddit Stories. Before I tell you the story that still gives me chills every time I think about it, I should probably set the stage a little. I grew up in a small town where everybody knew everybody, where family names carried weight heavier than gold. My family, the Callaways, had lived there for generations, so deeply rooted that you could barely mention anything in town without tracing it back to one of my ancestors. My childhood wasn't extraordinary. At least, it didn't seem so at the time. There were the usual family gatherings, arguments over who got grandma's recipes just right, whispered dramas that only surfaced after a few glasses of wine at Thanksgiving. But underneath it all, there was a sense of tradition, of duty, almost like an invisible hand steering all of us down paths already carved long before we took our first breath. And that's how I ended up entangled in something much bigger than myself. Something that would reveal secrets buried for decades and twist my understanding of family into something unrecognizable. The story really began one summer evening when the air was thick with the scent of blooming magnolias, and the world outside my window buzzed with the lazy hum of cicadas. I had just returned home from college, looking forward to nothing more than sleeping in my childhood bed and eating home-cooked meals that didn't taste like sadness and microwave radiation. My parents had decided that since I was now an adult, it was time for me to take responsibility for some family matters, the first of which involved an old trunk in the attic that no one had dared touch since my great-grandmother passed away. They said it was time to go through it, catalog what was inside, and decide what to keep and what to donate. It sounded simple enough, the kind of tedious task that could maybe be salvaged with the right playlist and enough iced coffee. I had no idea then that opening that trunk would be like opening a vein straight into the heart of a buried family history, messy and tangled and impossible to ignore. The attic was exactly as I remembered it, a dusty museum of forgotten treasures and broken dreams. Wobbly stacks of old newspapers, framed paintings with peeling corners, a taxidermied squirrel wearing a faded ribbon around its neck. A gift from some eccentric great-uncle, apparently. The trunk was tucked away in the farthest corner. Half buried are a moth-eaten quilt and a broken rocking horse. It looked ancient with rusted hinges and a lock that seemed more ornamental than functional. As I brushed away the dust, I noticed something strange, the initials EC, carved into the wood, barely visible but unmistakable. None of my relatives had those initials, at least none that I knew of. A little thrill of curiosity ran through me as I opened the lid, which creaked loudly, almost like a groan of protest. Inside, I found an assortment of letters tied with ribbon, a delicate silver locket, and, most curious of all, a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and brittle with age. Naturally, I reached for the journal first. It felt like something out of a movie, like I was about to uncover some great mystery. And in a way I was. The journal belonged to Eleanor Callaway, a name I'd never heard before. Page after page, I read about a life that was both deeply familiar and completely alien. Eleanor wrote about growing up in the same town, under the same suffocating expectations of family legacy. But she also wrote about a secret, a love that she had to hide, a decision that would haunt her descendants if the truth ever came to light. I barely slept that night, poring over every word by the dim light of a bedside lamp. Who was she? What was the secret? And why had no one ever mentioned her? Over the next few days, the journal consumed me. I started asking questions casually at first, dropping Eleanor's name at dinner as if I had stumbled across it randomly. My parents stiffened immediately. My mom pursed her lips, while my dad shot her a look that spoke volumes. They claimed not to know who Eleanor was, said she must have been a distant cousin or something. But I could tell they were lying, the kind of lie that sticks to the roof of your mouth and sours your breath. It only made me dig deeper. I spent hours in the local library, sifting through dusty records, old town archives, marriage licenses, death certificates. There was no Eleanor Callaway listed anywhere. It was like she had been erased. Except she hadn't. Late one afternoon, I found a newspaper clipping so yellowed it crumbled at the edges when I touched it. The headline was small, almost hidden among announcements for local bake sales and church picnics. Mysterious disappearance rocks Calloway family. The article was brief, barely more than a few paragraphs, but it confirmed what I already suspected: Eleanor Calloway had existed, and she had vanished without a trace on the night of her 21st birthday, leaving behind only a note that was never made public. Suddenly, the trunk, the journal, the initials carved into the wood, it all took on a darker, more urgent meaning. This wasn't just some old family drama. This was a missing person, a mystery that had been quietly buried under generations of polite smiles and carefully curated holiday cards. I started noticing things after that. Subtle things. The way my mother would flinch whenever the attic door creaked open. The way my grandfather, usually so quick to share stories about the good old days, would abruptly change the subject if the conversation veered too close to anything before the 1940s. And then there were the dreams. Vivid, unsettling dreams of a young woman in a lace dress, standing at the edge of a forest, her face obscured by shadows, beckoning me closer. I would wake up with the scent of magnolias heavy in my nostrils, the sound of distant music, a waltz, maybe, echoing in my ears. It all came to a head one night when I decided to confront my parents directly. I waited until after dinner, when the house was settling into its usual nighttime hush, and cornered them in the living room. I showed them the journal, the locket, the newspaper clipping. I asked them, no, demanded, to tell me the truth. For a long moment, they just stared at me, their faces pale and tight with fear. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight 100 years, my father spoke. Eleanor wasn't a distant cousin, he said. She was your great-grandmother's sister, and she didn't just disappear. She ran away. Why, I asked, heart hammering against my ribs. What could have been so terrible that she had to vanish completely, to be scrubbed from our history like an inconvenient smudge? My mother looked at me then, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to shed. She fell in love, she whispered, with someone she wasn't supposed to, someone forbidden. They wouldn't say more, wouldn't tell me who he was or why it had been so scandalous that Eleanor had to choose between love and her own existence. But now, I was determined. I couldn't leave it alone. I felt like I owed it to Eleanor, and maybe to myself, to find out the whole story, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Little did I know, the truth wasn't just uncomfortable. It was devastating. And once I uncovered it, there would be no going back. I spent the next week submerged in secrets, chasing whispers through the crumbling halls of our town's collective memory. Every day I pieced together a little more of Eleanor's life, stitching the scraps into something resembling a portrait, though it remained smudged and incomplete. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that whatever had happened wasn't just a matter of a disapproved romance. It had shattered something fundamental in the Calloway family, something they had spent decades pretending was never broken. I became a ghost in my own house, sneaking into the attic late at night to reread the journal, visiting the library archives so often the librarian began setting aside materials for me in anticipation, and even driving out to the old, crumbling Calloway estate on the edge of town, where ivy strangled the once grand columns and the windows stared out like blind eyes. The estate was abandoned but not empty. In the back of the house, buried under collapsed rafters and warped floorboards, I found a hidden room. It was little more than a narrow crawl space, but inside were relics of another life. A faded photograph of Eleanor with a young man I didn't recognize, letters tied with fraying ribbon, and a silver ring with a tiny engraving inside. Forever yours, H.H. I had no idea who he was, but now I had a clue. A real, tangible link to the mystery. Eleanor's forbidden love had a name, or at least an initial. I stuffed the letters into my backpack, heart hammering, and got out of there before the rotting floor could collapse beneath me. Back home, I locked myself in my room and read the letters one by one. They were passionate, hatching things, full of longing and promises to run away together, to start a new life far from the suffocating expectations of their families. H wasn't just any boy. He was from the Millers, one of the oldest families in town, sworn enemies of the Callaways after some long, forgotten land dispute. It was the classic star-crossed lover story, only this one had been carefully erased from both family histories, as if pretending it never happened could undo it. But as I pieced the timeline together, something didn't add up. The last letter from H was different. Frantic, desperate. He wrote that he had to leave town immediately, that he feared for Eleanor's safety, that they knew about them and would never allow it. No signature, just the final line scrawled so messily it was almost unreadable. Trust no one, not even your blood. The words burrowed into my mind and stayed there, gnawing at my thoughts. If Eleanor's family, my family, had known about the relationship, what had they done to stop it? And who exactly was the? I thought about the way my grandfather's voice tightened when I mentioned anything before his time, the way my mother's hands shook when she touched Eleanor's locket. This wasn't just shame over an embarrassing scandal. This was fear. Real, gut-deep fear. Determined to find answers, I decided to visit the one person who might remember, my great-aunt June. She was the oldest living Callaway, sharp as a tack despite her 90+ years, and famously opinionated about everything from politics to pie recipes. My parents had warned me she was too frail for visitors, but I knew that was just another lie. So I drove out to the nursing home on the outskirts of town, clutching the locket and the letters like talismans. June's room was bright and cluttered, filled with floral quilts and porcelain knickknacks. She squinted at me when I entered, then smiled a crooked smile. "You've got the Callaway fire," she said without preamble. Wah, just like Eleanor. Hearing her name spoken aloud sent a jolt through me. I sat down, heart hammering, and showed her the locket. Her fingers trembled as she took it, tracing the delicate engraving. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, in a voice so soft I had to lean in to hear, she began to speak. "Eleanor was the brightest of us," she said. "Too bright, too wild. They tried to clip her wings, but you can't keep a bird like that in a cage." Her eyes grew distant. She loved Henry Miller. God, how she loved him. They were going to run away together. Start fresh, somewhere nobody knew their names. But what? I urged, barely breathing. June's face crumpled. They found out. Your great-grandfather, he couldn't stand the thought of a Callaway mixing with a Miller. Said it would be the end of everything we'd built. So her voice broke. He made sure it wouldn't happen. I stared at her horrified. What did he do? She shook her head. I don't know exactly. I was just a child. But after that night, Henry disappeared. Some said he ran. Some said she trailed off. And Eleanor, she wasn't the same. She wandered the woods for days, raving, calling his name. Then one night, she was just gone. No goodbye, just gone. I left the nursing home numb, my mind spinning. If my great-grandfather had driven Henry away, or worse, then my entire family legacy was built on betrayal and violence. And Eleanor, she had been collateral damage. A bright, beautiful soul snuffed out by pride and hate. But even then, the story wasn't over. Because as I dug deeper into the town records, I found something that stopped me cold. A birth certificate, dated a year after Eleanor's disappearance. Mother Eleanor Callaway, father unknown, Child Hazel Callaway, Hazel, H. The pieces slammed together with dizzying clarity. Eleanor hadn't just been running away with Henry. She had been pregnant. The family hadn't just destroyed a romance. They had destroyed an entire new generation before it even had a chance to begin. But Hazel had survived. Somehow. Hidden, protected. Maybe even passed off as the child of another Callaway to avoid scandal. And that meant I pulled up the family tree my mother kept meticulously updated in the old Bible that sat on our living room shelf. There, under the 1940s births, was Hazel Callaway, listed as the daughter of Eleanor's sister, Margaret. But if the birth certificate was right, Margaret wasn't her mother. Eleanor was. And if Hazel was Eleanor's daughter, then Hazel's children and grandchildren, including me. I slammed the Bible shut, heart racing. I wasn't just Eleanor's great-great-niece. I was her direct descendant. The ground seemed to tilt under me. Everything I thought I knew about my identity, my family, my place in the world. It was all built on a lie. A carefully constructed web of deceit designed to protect a legacy that didn't deserve protection. And yet, even then, I hadn't reached the end of the truth. Because tucked inside the last pages of Eleanor's journal, hidden beneath a false bottom, I found one final letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was more like a confession. She wrote of the night she disappeared, of the fear and rage that drove her into the woods. She wrote of Henry, of the plans they had made, of the tiny life growing inside her, and she wrote of the deal she struck. I couldn't save him, she wrote, but I could save our child. I made a bargain, sealed in blood and desperation. I gave up everything, my name, my freedom, my place in the family, to protect what mattered most. If you are reading this, know that blood calls to blood. And someday, you will have to finish what I could not. I read the letter over and over, trying to make sense of it. A bargain, sealed in blood. It sounded like something out of a Gothic novel, not the neat, sunny world my family had always pretended to live in. But deep down, I knew it was real. I could feel it, a pull in my bones, a whisper in my blood. The story wasn't finished. It was just beginning. And I was the one who would have to end it. I couldn't sleep after finding Eleanor's last letter. I kept hearing her words over and over. Blood calls to blood. What did that even mean? It sounded ancient, almost like a warning or a curse. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, or at least the face I imagined for her, peering out from the shadows of the woods, waiting. I felt like I was being summoned, pulled toward something that had been dormant for generations, but was now waking because I had stirred it. There was no more denying it. Whatever bargain Eleanor had made, whatever unfinished business she had left behind, it was now mine to face. But I didn't know where to start. How do you finish a promise made in blood almost a century ago? For the next few days, I went through the motions of normal life, but I wasn't really there. At dinner, I barely touched my food, lost in thought. I jumped at every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows. My parents noticed, of course. They kept exchanging glances, their faces drawn tight with worry, but they didn't say anything. Maybe they were afraid of what might come out if they opened their mouths. Or maybe they already knew there was no stopping what had been set in motion. Then, one night, I found something that changed everything. I was back in the attic, searching through boxes I had already checked a dozen times before, when I found a small wooden box tucked inside an old hat box. It was unremarkable except for the symbol burned into the lid. A tree, its roots tangled into a knot. When I opened it, I found a bundle of old photographs, most of them faded and creased from age. They showed the Calloway estate in its prime, grand parties, family picnics, formal portraits with stiff smiles. And in almost every photo, there was Eleanor. Sometimes smiling, sometimes looking over her shoulder as if she heard something just out of frame. Always that same strange tension, as if she didn't quite belong. But it was the last photo that made my blood run cold. It showed Eleanor standing at the edge of the woods behind the estate, the same woods I had dreamed about. She wore the lace dress from my visions, and in her hand she held the silver locket I had found in the trunk. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, indistinct, watching her. There was no name on the back, no date. But I knew somehow that it had been taken the night she disappeared. That photo became my obsession. I stared at it for hours, trying to make out the figure in the woods. Was it Henry? Was it someone? Or something else? I needed answers, and I knew the only place I would find them was the woods themselves. The thought terrified me, but it also thrilled me. This was what Eleanor had left for me. Her final breadcrumb trail. I waited until a night when the moon was full, casting everything in silver and shadow. I told my parents I was going to meet some friends, a lie that tasted bitter on my tongue, and instead drove out to the old Callaway estate. The house loomed like a skeleton against the night sky, window shattered, door hanging open like a yawning mouth. I didn't even glance at it. My feet carried me straight to the woods. The moment I stepped under the canopy of trees, the air changed. It was heavier, denser, charged with something electric. Every sound seemed magnified. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant hoot of an owl, the frantic pounding of my own heart. I followed the path from the photo, or at least where I thought it had been, pushing deeper into the forest until the house disappeared behind me, and all that remained was darkness and the whisper of the wind. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to stretch and bend around me. But eventually I found it. A clearing, ringed by ancient oaks whose branches twisted together like skeletal fingers. In the center was a stone well, so old it was almost entirely swallowed by moss and vines. And carved into the stones around its rim was the same symbol from the wooden box. The tree with knotted roots. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I had come too far. I knelt beside the well and brushed away the moss, revealing more carvings. Words barely legible. Blood to bind. Blood to break. The phrase from Eleanor's letter came rushing back to me. Blood calls to blood. I didn't know what I was doing. I only knew that somehow this was the place, the heart of the secret my family had buried. I took out the locket from my pocket. I had brought it with me, almost without thinking, and opened it. Inside was a tiny portrait of Eleanor, and opposite it, a lock of hair, still a pale, ghostly gold even after all these years. Before I could second guess myself, I pricked my finger on the sharp edge of the locket and let a single drop of blood fall onto the stone well. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground trembled. A deep, low sound rumbled up from the earth, like a giant clearing its throat. The trees around the clearing shivered, though there was no wind. The well began to glow faintly, a sickly green light seeping up from its depths. And then, from the darkness beyond the clearing, came a figure. At first, I thought it was Eleanor. The dress, the pale hair, it matched the visions I had seen. But as she stepped closer, I realized this wasn't a woman at all. It was something else, something wrong. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. Its face was a blank mask, smooth and featureless except for a gaping black hole where the mouth should be. It raised one trembling hand and pointed at me. "You carry her blood." A voice rasped from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You carry her, Deb?" I stumbled back, heart hammering against my ribs. "What debt?" I gasped. "The bargain," the voice whispered. "A life for a life. A name for a name. Broken when she fled. Left unfinished. Now you must pay." I didn't understand. None of it made sense. But instinct took over. I held up the locket like a shield. "I'm not her," I shouted. "I'm not Eleanor." The figure shuddered, a horrible, convulsing motion that made my stomach turn. "Blood is blood," it hissed. "Deb is Deb." I felt a coldness wrap around my ankles, looking down to see shadowy tendrils slithering up from the ground, trying to drag me down into the earth. I fought, kicking and thrashing, but they were strong, pulling me closer and closer to the well. In a flash of clarity, I remembered the words carved into the stone of blood to bend, blood to break. Bending had already begun. I needed to break it. Desperately, I grabbed the lock of Eleanor's hair from the locket and flung it into the well. There was a blinding flash of light. The ground heaved beneath me. The figure let out a sound, not a scream, but a roar of rage and despair, and then exploded into a cloud of ash that blew away on a sudden gust of wind. The tendrils dissolved. The glow faded. The woods fell silent. I lay there for a long time, gasping, staring up at the stars that winked through the gaps in the trees. I didn't know if I had truly ended it, or just delayed the inevitable. But for the first time in days, I felt lighter, as if some heavy chain that had wrapped around my soul had finally snapped. When I finally staggered back to my car, I found something on the driver's seat. A note written in delicate, old-fashioned handwriting. You chose wisely. The debt is paid. But the truth is never so simple. I turned it over, half expect to find more, but there was nothing. Driving home, I couldn't shake the feeling that although I had survived the night, the story Eleanor had started wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. For days after that night in the woods, the world around me felt wrong, as if reality itself had shifted just a few degrees off-center. I tried to return to normal, to slip back into the routine of my quiet life, but everything had a strange, unreal quality. Familiar faces seemed like masks stretched too tightly over bone. Conversations felt rehearsed, words falling into place with mechanical precision. Even the house, my childhood sanctuary, creaked and groaned in ways it never had before, as if mourning the secrets now dragged into the light. But it wasn't just paranoia gnawing at me. I knew deep down that something had changed when I threw Eleanor's lock of hair into that well. Something had been broken, yes, but something else had been set free. At first, the signs were small. I began noticing subtle shifts around the house doors left ajar that I knew I had closed. Lights flickering when there was no storm, photographs on the walls slightly tilted without explanation. Once, I found the locket, the same one I had thrown into the well, resting on my pillow when I woke up, gleaming innocently in the early morning light. I had no memory of retrieving it, and when I tried to show it to my parents, it vanished the moment they looked at it, leaving me clutching nothing but air. They exchanged worried glances, but said nothing, treating my growing distress like a phase I would eventually outgrow. But I knew better. I could feel the thin membrane between the past and the present stretching thinner with each passing day. Ready to tear, and then came the dreams. They weren't like the fleeting, half-formed nightmares I'd had before. These were vivid, visceral, cinematic. Every night, I found myself back in the woods, but not the ruined, overgrown forest of today. No, in the dreams the woods were alive, lush and vibrant, filled with golden light and music that thrummed through the ground like a heartbeat. I saw Eleanor there, always at the edge of my vision, laughing and spinning among the trees, her lace dress trailing behind her like mist. But every time I tried to reach her, something dark would slither between us. A shadow with too many eyes and mouths, whispering promises I didn't want to hear. I would wake drenched in sweat, the scent of magnolias choking me, my heart racing as if I had run for miles. After a week of these dreams, I realized I wasn't just seeing the past. I was being called into it. It all came to a head one evening as I sat alone in the attic, the journal open on my lap, the last traces of sunset bleeding through the cracked window panes. I had been trying to decode Eleanor's final entries, searching for anything that could explain the lingering presence I felt stalking me. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A hidden compartment in the spine of the journal, so cleverly concealed it was nearly invisible. My hands trembling, I pried it open and found a small, brittle scrap of parchment covered in faded ink. It was a map, not of the town, but of the woods. Or rather, a version of the woods that no longer existed. There were landmarks marked with strange symbols, a hollow tree, a circle of stones, a crooked stream. And at the very center, marked with a crude drawing of the same knotted tree symbol, was something labeled only as the root. I knew instantly that this was where I had to go. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, a bottle of water, and a deep, knowing sense of dread, I set out that night. The woods seemed to welcome me, parting before me like a living thing. I followed the map as best I could, though the landscape had changed over the decades. Some landmarks had vanished, others had twisted into grotesque parodies of their former selves. The crooked stream was now little more than a muddy ditch. The circle of stones had crumbled into jagged ruins. But the hollow tree that remained, gone gnarled and blackened with age, its trunk split open like a screaming mouth. I stepped through it without hesitation. The air changed immediately. It was colder here, sharper, as if I had passed through an invisible barrier. The trees were denser, their branches knitting together overhead to block out the stars. The ground sloped downward, pulling me deeper into the earth's embrace. And then, finally, I saw it. The root. It was not a tree at all, but a vast network of roots, twisted and knotted together into a pulsating mass that throbbed with a sickly, amber light. It looked almost alive, like a heart torn from a giant's chest and left to rot in the dark, and embedded deep within it, barely visible, was something that glinted in the beam of my flashlight. The locket, the real one. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to run. As I reached out to touch it, the ground shuddered, and a voice spoke. Not aloud, but directly into my mind. "You have come to claim your inheritance." The words were not a question. I swallowed hard. What inheritance? The legacy of blood and betrayal. The burden of the Calloways. The debt paid in part, but never fully satisfied. The root pulsed and images flooded my mind. Visions of Eleanor, weeping beside the well, Henry, his face twisted in agony, my great-grandfather standing over them with a look of cold fury. And then others, nameless, faceless figures throughout the generations, all bound by the same invisible chain, all trapped by the choices made long ago. "You can end it," the voice whispered. "But you must choose." I understood then. This was the true bargain Eleanor had made. To protect her child, she had bound her bloodline to this place, to this ancient, malevolent force. Every generation was touched by it, shaped by it, drawn back to it, until someone, me, was strong enough to break it. I closed my fingers around the locket. Pain lanced through me, white, hot, and searing, as if my very soul was being ripped apart. I saw flashes of every Calloway who had ever lived, their lives flashing by in an endless torrent of joy and sorrow and regret. I felt their hopes, their fears, their sins pressing down on me, trying to crush me into nothingness. But then, amid the storm, I saw Eleanor. She stood before me, not as a ghost, but as she truly was, fierce, defiant, burning with a light that no darkness could snuff out. She reached out, her hand closing over mine, and together we pulled. The root shrieked, a sound that tore through the earth and sky, a final death cry that echoed across the generations. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the root was gone. The clearing was empty. The woods were just woods again, dark and still and ordinary. I stumbled back to my car at dawn, the locket heavy in my pocket, the map burned to ash in my hand. At home, my parents were waiting for me, their faces pale and drawn. But when they saw me, something shifted. My father stepped forward, his voice trembling. "It's over, isn't it?" I nodded. For the first time in my life, I truly understood what it meant to be a Calloway. Not a name bound by pride and secrecy, but a legacy of survival, of choosing love over fear. Even in the face of unimaginable darkness, the debt was paid. But the scars would remain, not as chains, but as reminders. And somewhere, in the depths of the woods, Eleanor's laughter echoed one final time, free at last. Life after breaking the root was like learning how to walk again in a body I barely recognized. For the first few weeks, everything felt muted, hollowed out. Like I had returned to a house where the furniture was the same, but all the people were different somehow. My parents hovered around me, treating me with a careful reverence, as if afraid that a sudden move or harsh word might shatter me completely. Maybe they sensed what I knew deep down. Something inside me had changed forever that night in the woods. I wasn't just carrying the memories of Eleanor's pain or the burden of the family's hidden shame. I had become something else entirely, a living testament to everything that had been buried, broken, and finally freed. The locket never left me after that. I wore it tucked beneath my shirt, close to my heart, where its tiny weight was a constant reminder of what I had survived. Sometimes, late at night when the house was silent, I would hold it and feel a faint warmth radiate from it, as if Eleanor's spirit still lingered, keeping watch over me. And the dreams, the endless dreams of the woods and the laughter and the looming shadow, slowly faded into something quieter, softer, like a memory you can almost catch if you close your eyes just right. But the town hadn't forgotten. Whispers followed me everywhere. In the aisles of the grocery store, at the gas station, even outside the tiny post office where Mrs. Green always managed to accidentally hand me someone else's mail just to get a good look at me. The Callaways had always been a family people whispered about, but now the whispers were louder, sharper, cutting through the sticky summer air like knives. Some said I had gone crazy, that I had gotten lost in the woods and never really come back. Others said I had found something out there, something dangerous, and brought it back with me. And a few, the oldest ones with eyes clouded by years of unspeakable knowledge, simply crossed themselves and hurried away when they saw me coming. I didn't blame them. If they knew even half the truth, they'd have run screaming. And yet, it wasn't fear that gnawed at me in the lonely hours before dawn. It was a strange, simmering sense of expectation, like standing on the edge of a cliff, feeling the ground crumble beneath your toes, knowing something was coming but having no idea what. Eleanor's final words still echoed in my mind. The truth is never so simple. I learned just how true that was the night a stranger came to town. It started with a knock at the door. Not the polite, tentative kind you expect from neighbors or delivery drivers, but a slow, deliberate pounding that rattled the hinges. My parents froze, exchanging a look thick with unspoken fear, and for a moment none of us moved. Then, against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I went to the door and opened it. He was tall, dressed in an old-fashioned suit that looked like it had been stitched together from shadows and memories. His face was sharp, angular, almost beautiful in a way that made your skin crawl. But it was his eyes that held me captive. Pale, colorless things that seemed to see straight through flesh and bone to the trembling soul beneath. "Oh, you have something that belongs to me," he said, his voice smooth as oil and twice as slippery. I clutched the locket instinctively, feeling it burn against my chest. "I don't know what you're talking about," I managed to choke out. He smiled, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Oh, but you do," he murmured. "Blood calls to blood, child, and debts unpaid rot the roots of the world." Before I could slam the door in his face, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a scrap of parchment. My breath caught in my throat. It was a torn piece of Eleanor's map, the same brittle, yellowed paper I had burned after finding the root. How he had it, I didn't know. But I understood the message loud and clear. The bargain Eleanor had struck hadn't ended with the destruction of the root. It had merely shifted. And now the debt collector had come to call. The stranger didn't wait for an invitation. He turned and disappeared down the front steps without a sound, leaving the air thick with the scent of smoke and something older, something fuller. That made bile rise in my throat. I spent the next day trying to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of my exhausted mind. But when I checked the spot by the well where the root had been, I found the ground disturbed. Claw marks gouged deep into the earth, and something worse, a handprint burned into the stone rim, fingers too long, too thin, seared black against the gray. Something had come through, and it wasn't finished. Over the following days, strange things began happening around town. Crops withered overnight under clear skies. Livestock were found dead, twisted into unnatural shapes, their eyes wide with terror. People started whispering about curses, about old evils waking from long slumber. Some packed up and left, their houses abandoned with dishes still on the table and clothes hanging in closets, as if they had fled in the middle of an ordinary life. And every time something new happened. A well running dry, a tree splitting down the middle for no reason. I would find a token left at my doorstep, a crow feather, a coil of dead vines, a stone carved with the knotted tree symbol, warnings, or perhaps promises. The town turned against me quickly after that. Old friends refused to meet my eyes. Strangers crossed the street to avoid me. Someone spray-painted "BYTCH" across the hood of my car in dripping red letters. My parents tried to shield me, but even they grew distant, weighed down by the growing dread that clung to the house like a second skin. I knew I couldn't stay. I knew the longer I remained, the worse it would get. Not just for me, but for everyone. But where could I go? Eleanor's journal held one final clue. Tucked between the pages was a letter I hadn't noticed before, addressed simply, "To the one who breaks the chain." It spoke of a place. Not a physical location, but a crossroads. A point where the bloodlines converged, where bargains could be remade or unmade. Eleanor had never been able to find it, bound as she was by fear and duty. But she believed that someday someone would. Someone strong enough to choose a different path. And so, with nothing but the locket around my neck and Eleanor's letter clutched in my hand, I left the only home I had ever known. I drove for hours, guided by instinct and the faint pull of something just beyond the edge of understanding. As night fell, I found myself at an ancient crossroads deep in the forest, where 4 crumbling paths met beneath a sky swollen with stars. I stepped out of the car and into the center of the crossroads. The locket grew warm against my skin, and from the darkness, the stranger emerged once more. "You cannot run from blood," he said, smiling that awful, beautiful smile. "I'm not running," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm ending this." He tilted his head, curious. "And how will you do that, little hare?" I raised the locket high, feeling it pulse with a power not entirely my own. "By choosing my own legacy," I said. The ground beneath us cracked open, and the crossroads were consumed by light. And in that moment, I realized the real debt had never been about payment. It had been about choice, and I was ready to make mine. The crossroads split apart under my feet, and for a second, I thought the world itself was tearing in two. Brilliant white light flooded everything, blinding and cold, searing straight into the deepest corners of my mind. I staggered. Locket clutched so tightly in my fist that the metal cut into my palm, the warmth of it now a scalding heat that sank into my bones. The stranger stood across from me, unmoving, his silhouette black against the blaze. I could feel the force of his gaze, a pressure against my chest, a gravity trying to pull me back into the cycle Eleanor had barely escaped. But I stayed rooted. The light formed shapes. Not fully real, not fully dream. Flickering images of everything that had come before, Eleanor running through the woods, the well swallowing secrets, Henry reaching out one last desperate time, and the twisted mass of roots pulsing underground. It showed the Callaways as they were, not the polished faffad the town revered, but a bloodline tangled by pride, fear, and a desperate need to survive at any cost. It showed the bargain, Eleanor's surrender to save her child, and the price that had been demanded across generations. The voice came again, low and resonant, not the stranger's but something older, as old as the earth itself. "Will you renew the bond?" I understood now. The crossroads wasn't just a place. It was a choice. The same choice Eleanor had once faced, though she had been too cornered, too desperate to make it freely. I wasn't trapped. Not yet. But if I faltered, if I accepted the cycle, it would begin again, stronger and darker than before. The stranger stepped closer, and the light bent around him like water. "This is your birthright," he said softly. "Your strength. Accept it, and you can reshape the world. No more fear. No more loss. Power enough to make sure no one you love ever suffers again." It was tempting. God, it was tempting. I saw flashes of everything I could fix. My parents' tired, anxious faces smoothing into peace, the town blossoming instead of rotting, all the heavy, poisoned history burned away like fog under the morning sun. All I had to do was accept. All I had to do was submit. But then I thought of Eleanor. Not the broken woman the family tried to erase, but the fierce spirit who had faced impossible choices and still fought for something better. I thought of the roots, gnarled and sick with secrets. I thought of the price of silence, and I knew I would not chain myself to the past. I would not seal my blood to old bargains. "I choose freedom," I said, the words ringing out louder than the crashing storm of light and shadow. "I break the chain." The locket burned brighter in my hand until I thought it would fuse with my flesh, and then, with a sound like 1,000 strings snapping at once, it shattered. A scream tore through the crossroads, high and keening, the stranger's form unraveling into black ribbons of smoke that twisted and writhed, and then disintegrated into nothingness. The ground steadied, the light faded, and I was alone. For a long moment, there was only silence. Deep, peaceful silence, like the moment after a final note fades from a song. Then I felt it, a shift, a release, as if invisible chains that had been wrapped around my soul, around the very bones of my family, had finally crumbled to dust. The crossroads remained, but it was different now. No longer a wound in the world, but a place of possibility, where four paths met not in entrapment, but in freedom. I left the forest at dawn, the rising sun casting gold over everything, burning away the last tattered remnants of night. As I drove back toward town, I noticed things had already begun to change. The air smelled sweeter, cleaner. The fields looked greener, the sky a sharper, clearer blue. It was as if a sickness had been lifted. When I pulled into the driveway, my parents rushed out to meet me. They didn't ask where I had been. They didn't have to. Something passed between us in that moment. A silent understanding that the legacy we had inherited no longer ruled us. We were free to build something new. Over the following weeks, small miracles unfolded. The abandoned houses were repaired. New businesses opened. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years shared meals and laughter again. The scars of the past remained, but they were no longer festering wounds. They were reminders, proof that even the deepest curses could be broken if only someone dared to face them. And me? I stayed. For a while, at least. I helped rebuild what had been broken. Not just the physical things, but the trust, the hope. I told Eleanor's true story, not just to my family, but to anyone willing to listen. I restored her name, her memory, to a place of honor. And when the time came to move on, I did so without fear. I kept the shattered remains of the locket in a small glass jar, a reminder of the choice I had made, of the bloodline I honored, not by perpetuating its sins, but by ending them. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind whistles through the trees and the world is hushed and waiting, I think I can hear Eleanor's laughter. Not the mournful echoes from before, but bright, joyous, free. And I smile, knowing that she is at peace. Knowing that, at last, we all are. The past does not own me. I chose a different ending. And for the first time in the long, tangled history of the Calloway name, that ending is just the beginning. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe and like the video.